The thing about Rothschild Island is that almost nobody talks about it, not because it's obscure. It sits in the Bellingshausen Sea off the western coast of Antarctica, a landmass large enough to be unmistakable on any serious nautical chart. The silence around it isn't ignorance, it's something quieter and more deliberate than that. I want to be precise about what I mean when I say silence. I don't mean absence. The island appears in charts, in expedition indices, in the footnotes of Antarctic historiography. What I mean is that it appears without weight, mentioned, acknowledged, and then passed over, as if the act of naming it was sufficient. Victorian explorers were not men who passed over things. They catalogued everything. The colour of pack ice at particular latitudes, the behaviour of petrels in storm systems, the precise angle of sunlight on geological formations they could barely reach. They had a professional horror of incompleteness, and yet Rothschild Island gets a note and nothing more. The standard historical framing is straightforward, and I want to give it its full due before we go anywhere else. The Bellingshausen Sea is one of the most hostile stretches of ocean on Earth. Ice conditions in that region are notoriously unpredictable, and close approach surveying was not merely difficult, it was frequently impossible. Under that reading, the sparse documentation makes perfect sense. If you cannot get close enough to land, you cannot record what is there. 19th century hydrographic surveys were limited by what ships could safely approach. A poorly documented island is not necessarily poorly understood. It might simply be one that could never be reached, and I held that explanation for a long time. It is rational, it is grounded in the actual conditions of Antarctic exploration, and it accounts for the absence without requiring anything unusual. Most historical gaps are filled by logistics, not secrets. Weather, ice, disease, equipment failure. These are the real villains of exploration history. But there is a problem with that framing. Not a dramatic problem, a quiet one. James Clark Ross, whose expedition operated in these waters between 1839 and 1843, achieved close survey work in some of the most ice-choked regions of the Southern Ocean. Ross was not a man who let ice stop him from documenting. Ross pushed HMS Erebus and HMS Terror through pack ice that earlier navigators had declared impassable. He reached the latitudes where the Ross Ice Shelf now bears his name. He recorded the active volcanic summit of Mount Erebus. He was meticulous, courageous, and possessed of an almost stubborn insistence on seeing things for himself. So when the expedition records reflect limited engagement with the Rothschild Island region, not forced avoidance due to catastrophic weather, but what reads as a navigational choice made in conditions that the logs themselves describe as manageable, that invites a second look. Not a panicked second look, a slow, careful one. I want to be precise about what I am and am not claiming. I am not saying the logs have been altered. I am observing that the records reflect choices, and that those choices in this particular location arrive without the explanatory context that Ross typically provided for every other navigational decision he made. Joseph Dalton Hooker, the expedition's botanist and one of the most observant scientific minds of his generation, kept correspondence throughout the voyage. His letters to his father, William Jackson Hooker, are preserved and well studied. What's interesting is not what they say about the waters near Rothschild Island, but how briefly they say it. Hooker was a writer of remarkable exactness. When he found something unremarkable, he said so with vivid specificity. Blank coastline was never blank to him. It was a particular kind of blank, a geological texture, a biological absence with character. The brevity of his entry for this passage is unlike his practice almost anywhere else. Now, I want to stop here and acknowledge something important. Hooker wrote thousands of pages of letters and journals. Selecting one brief entry and treating it as significant is exactly the kind of motivated reasoning I try hardest to avoid. Brief entries happen. Fatigue, illness, bad light, routine sailing, all of these produce short notes. I would set it aside entirely if it stood alone. But the brevity at Rothschild Island doesn't stand alone. That's what took me a long time to sit with. It is one instance in what becomes, when you look carefully enough, a pattern, and patterns are harder to dismiss than isolated anomalies. The Belgian Antarctic expedition of 1897 to 1899, aboard the Belgica under Adrien de Gerlache, was the first expedition to winter in Antarctic waters. Its scientific record is detailed, its hardships well documented. Frederick Cook, the American physician aboard, wrote extensively about every aspect of those months locked in the ice. The Belgica's drift took the ship through the Bellingshausen Sea. De Gerlache's charts from this period are precise instruments. They show careful attention to islands, ice formations, and coastal features across the entire route. What they show for the stretch adjacent to Rothschild Island is again very little. Sightings noted, no detail pursued, forward motion recorded. Here is where I have to be methodical, because the easy temptation is to simply stack absences and call them evidence. That's not how this works. Two expeditions making limited observations of one island proves nothing except that two expeditions made limited observations. The Antarctic coastline is enormous. Many islands received thin documentation. What you need, if this pattern is going to mean something, is a reason to believe the limited documentation is selective rather than uniform. You need to show that these same expeditions, in comparable conditions, managed detail elsewhere. And that is precisely what the record shows. The detail exists around Rothschild Island. It simply stops there. The Gerlache's charts include precise depth soundings, ice edge profiles, and geological notations for coastal features on both sides of the region where Rothschild Island sits. The neighbouring Alexander Island receives multiple pages of careful description. The work is there, the capacity was there. The curiosity, which was abundant everywhere else, went quiet in one specific place. Cook's personal account of the Belgica expedition, published in 1900, runs to considerable length. His eye for detail was clinical and almost obsessive. He recorded the crew's psychological deterioration during the Antarctic winter with the same precision he used for weather data. His passage on the Bellingshausen coastal survey is, by his own standards, thin. Think about what I'm describing. Two expeditions separated by nearly 60 years, operating under different national flags, with different commanders, different scientific mandates, different political pressures, different technology, one British, one Belgian, no institutional overlap, no shared sponsor, no reason to coordinate. And yet the same editorial restraint appears in the same geographical location. Let me sit with the strongest counter-argument, because it deserves full consideration. The most straightforward explanation is that Rothschild Island simply was not interesting. A large body in an inhospitable sea, geologically unremarkable in regional context, biologically sparse. Explorers faced with genuine hardship prioritized their limited energy and attention accordingly. That argument has real weight. I take it seriously. But it collides with one observable fact. Antarctic explorers of the Victorian and Edwardian periods were not selective about what they found remarkable. They documented ordinary coastlines at exhaustive length because completeness was the scientific obligation. Unremarkability was never, in their practice, sufficient reason for brevity. There is also a geographical consideration worth raising. 20th century aerial surveys and satellite imaging of the wider Rothschild Island region revealed something that would have been immediately interesting to a Victorian geographer: distinctive coastal formations along the island's eastern face, structurally different from the surrounding terrain in ways that invite geological attention. I am not going to overstate what that means. Unusual coastal formations are common in Antarctica. The continent is full of geological surprises that remain unvisited and understudied. The presence of a distinctive feature is not by itself evidence that anyone saw it and chose to say little. It is simply a fact that sits awkwardly. But here is where the awkwardness compounds. The eastern face of the island, facing toward the interior of the Bellingshausen Sea, would have been visible, not certain, but possible under the right ice and weather conditions from the navigational paths both expeditions took. Not guaranteed, not obvious, but possible. That word carries weight here. There is a third point of reference I want to bring into this, and it requires care because the record here is less direct. Otto Nordenskjöld, whose Swedish Antarctic expedition operated between 1901 and 1904, worked primarily in the Weddell Sea region, but had access to the accumulated navigational knowledge of prior expeditions in these waters. In Nordenskjöld's published account, he makes references to received information about the western coastal regions of the Antarctic Peninsula, information he characterizes with a kind of qualified caution that stands out in the context of an otherwise confident scientific narrator. He did not typically hedge on intelligence received from experienced navigators he respected. What information prompted that caution? He doesn't specify. The reference reads like a footnote to a conversation that happened outside the published record, something understood among the community of Antarctic navigators, something that circulated in the spaces between official accounts that never quite made it into the formal literature in any direct terms. And this is where the question starts to feel genuinely difficult to sit with. What I'm describing across these expeditions is not a named conspiracy. I want to say that plainly. There is no evidence of a memo sent between London, Brussels and Stockholm instructing explorers to limit their documentation of a particular Antarctic island. That kind of explicit coordination is not what this pattern suggests. What it suggests is something more mundane and in many ways more unsettling, that institutions which share certain interests develop shared behaviours without requiring central direction. Scientific bodies in the Victorian era had a powerful common instinct around what deserved amplification and what was better left quiet. The Royal Geographical Society in London, the Belgian Geographical Society, the Swedish academies that sponsored Antarctic science, these were not shadow governments. They were professional bodies with professional concerns, funding, reputation, political relationships with their sponsoring states, and a genuine institutional anxiety about findings that could not be cleanly categorized. You don't need to name a single architect of suppression to account for collective silence. You only need to understand how knowledge is filtered at the point of publication. The explorer returns. The expedition account is prepared. Certain things are emphasized, certain things are not. That editorial process has always existed and always reflected unstated priorities. The question is not whether scientific institutions in the Victorian era edited what was published. They did, routinely, openly, and without apology. The question is whether this particular location, at this particular moment in Antarctic history, triggered that editorial instinct consistently across multiple independent institutions, because if it did, you need a reason. I should address the possibility that I am constructing this pattern from the wrong material. Expedition accounts were often incomplete for reasons of length, audience, and publishing convention. Not every observation made it into print, and the decision to omit was frequently aesthetic rather than strategic. Long ocean passages with limited incident were routinely compressed. That is a genuinely sound objection, and I hold it seriously. The problem is that it applies uniformly to all passages in these accounts, and the compression in these accounts is not uniform. Detailed treatment appears consistently where we might expect it. The compression appears consistently where we might not. The exception is geographical, not random. There is also the matter of how Ross himself characterized the expedition in later years. In his private correspondence from the 1850s onward, Ross referred to the Southern Ocean surveys with an uncharacteristic vagueness that some of his biographers have noted, without knowing quite what to make of it or where to put it in the frame of his otherwise precise career. He was, by then, a man with nothing left to prove, and no professional reason for evasion. His letters from this period are largely confident, specific, and proud in the way that men of genuine achievement are permitted to be. The softening, when it comes, is local and consistent, and it comes in the same place. I recognize that I'm reading tone into correspondence, and that this is among the more fragile forms of historical analysis. A man can be vague for 100 reasons that have nothing to do with concealment. Aging, discretion, simple loss of interest, all of these produce exactly the textual behavior I'm describing. I know that, but I also know that James Clark Ross was one of the most disciplined writers in the history of British exploration. His voyage of discovery and research in the southern and Antarctic regions, published in 1847, is a model of navigational precision extended into prose. When his precision fails in a specific place, the question is legitimate. Now comes the part one want to handle most carefully, because this is where speculation becomes the easiest trap. What did the Victorian explorers actually see near Rothschild Island? I genuinely don't know. I am not going to tell you. Anyone who claims certainty here is not working from evidence. They are working from imagination. What I can say is this. The Antarctic coastline in that period regularly produced observations that confounded the scientific frameworks explorers brought with them. Unusual ice formations, acoustic phenomena, visual distortions caused by extreme atmospheric refraction. The Southern Ocean is full of things that look impossible and are, in fact, only deeply unfamiliar. Antarctic explorers frequently encountered sights they couldn't classify using the categories available to them. Ross's own encounter with the great ice shelf that now bears his name was initially reported with uncertainty. He struggled to describe what he was seeing in terms his audience would understand. New things demanded new language, and language took time. So I am not suggesting that what was seen near Rothschild Island was impossible in any physical sense. I am suggesting that whatever the observation was, whatever specific thing produced this consistent cross-institutional editorial restraint, it was something that did not fit comfortably into what explorers of that era were supposed to find there. The Victorian explorer arrived at the ice with a set of scientific expectations. He expected geological formations, biological data, navigational challenges, weather phenomena. He was prepared for hardship and for danger. What he was not prepared for, and what the published account had no ready framework to accommodate, was genuine surprise of a particular kind. When surprise of that kind occurred, something that defied immediate classification, something the scientific vocabulary of the period couldn't metabolize, the institutional response was not always suppression in any active sense. It was more often a collective agreement not to emphasize, to move the anomaly to a footnote, to let time make it small. This is the mechanism I keep returning to, because it requires the least conspiracy and the most human behavior. Institutions protect their coherence, scientists protect their credibility, explorers who depended on the continued funding of geographical societies protected their professional standing. None of these are villainous motivations. All of them produce the same result, and the result is this: a large, clearly visible Antarctic island, approached by multiple well-documented expeditions over more than half a century, that produced a body of observational literature so thin and so consistently thin across institutional lines that the thinness itself becomes the most informative thing about it. I have spent a long time looking for the explanation that dissolves this. The climate argument, the ice approach argument, the publishing convention argument, the editorial compression argument. I've held each of them and tested them against the record. Each one is reasonable in isolation. Not one of them survives the full pattern without requiring the others. What I'm left with is not a theory. I want to be precise about that, because a theory implies a conclusion, and I don't have one. What I have is a shape, the outline of something that was seen and then, through a process that was neither simple nor singular, did not make it to the page. The island is still there. Modern satellite imagery has given us more of its surface than any Victorian navigator ever saw, and in some of those images, the eastern coastal formation I mentioned earlier is clearly visible, a structure whose geometry in certain light conditions at certain resolutions produces a moment of pause. Not drama, just pause. I'm not going to tell you what to make of that pause. I'm not sure what to make of it myself. What I know is that James Clark Ross sailed past something in that sea and chose not to write about it, and that choice has travelled forward through time, unreduced and still unanswered. The question is not what they suppressed. The question is why suppression, in this place, among these particular men, required no communication and no coordination, only shared silence. That kind of silence has a name inside institutions. It's called understanding. And somewhere in the Bellingshausen Sea, a very old understanding is still holding